April 1945. The rain has stopped, but the ground still glistens with cold mud outside a captured railway yard near Remagen. The war is ending, yet chaos has not learned how to stop. Beneath a gray dawn sky, hundreds of German prisoners shuffle into a makeshift collection camp. Wire fences, canvas tents, the smell of disinfectant and smoke. Among them are boys, some barely 15, faces hollowed by exhaustion and hunger. Their helmets hang loose, rifles long discarded. An American field hospital hums nearby. Nurses in olive drab uniforms move briskly between cots, the clatter of tin trays mixing with the low moans of the wounded. A Red Cross worker, no older than 25, kneels to offer a cup of broth to a trembling boy. His hands shake as he grips it, eyes wide, unsure if kindness is a trick. Then she calls him son. The word cuts through weeks of terror. The boy begins to weep, quietly, helplessly, as the war finally collapses inside him. To understand why those German boys stood shivering behind barbed wire in the spring of 1945, we must trace their story backward, through years of deliberate molding, fear, and collapse. 12 years earlier, in 1933, the Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth, was a badge of belonging for millions of German children. What began as a youth organization soon became a machine of indoctrination. Marching songs replaced lullabies. Loyalty oaths replaced bedtime prayers. By 1939, membership was effectively mandatory. For boys as young as 10, the world narrowed to slogans, uniforms, and drills, where weakness was mocked and obedience glorified. By 1943, with the Eastern Front bleeding men, the regime began to prepare these youths for war. Training camps taught them to fire rifles and man anti-aircraft guns. School lessons were filled with lectures about defending the fatherland from invaders. Some believed every word. Others simply followed because everyone did. Then came 1944, the year everything fell apart. Allied bombers reduced German cities to ashes. The front lines cracked under relentless pressure. Men who once marched proudly now crawled through rubble. In October, the regime issued the Volkssturm decree. Every able-bodied male aged 16 to 60 was to fight. But desperation doesn't count birthdays. In many towns, boys of 14 and 15 were pressed into uniform. They stood watch on bridges with rifles taller than themselves. They manned anti-aircraft guns that recoiled harder than their shoulders could bear. By March 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine, these children were no longer a propaganda image. They were the last defense of a collapsing empire. American soldiers advancing through the Ruhr and Rhineland met them often, frightened, thin, and confused. Some fought to the end, clinging to the words of officers who told them surrender meant death. Others threw away their weapons the moment they saw a white star painted on an American tank. The U.S. Army's rapid advance created logistical chaos. Thousands of prisoners flooded into collection points every day. Men, women, soldiers, civilians, and increasingly, boys. Field commanders were unprepared for what they found. Prisoners too young to shave, trembling from cold and hunger, their uniforms stitched from scraps. By April, makeshift POW enclosures spread across Western Germany. Open fields bordered by wire, with limited shelter and constant overcrowding. Geneva Convention rules applied, but food and transport were strained beyond capacity. The U.S. command ordered immediate medical screenings to separate the wounded and the underage. Records from the 106th Evacuation Hospital near Andernach note multiple youth POWs treated for malnutrition, trench foot, and respiratory infections. Within those same days, a new kind of frontline appeared, not one of weapons, but of care. American nurses, medics, and Red Cross workers were deployed near prisoner intake sites. Many of them had seen the aftermath of battle. The wounded GIs, the ruined villages, the silent convoys of refugees. Yet the sight of enemy children in uniform, too small for their boots, too weak to stand, struck something deeper. A nurse named Lilith Margaret Stanley later recalled in her field notes, "They were not soldiers when we met them. They were boys who had run out of orders. The chaos of occupation blurred moral lines. The same soldiers who had fought through the Ardennes now handed soup to the enemy's children. Compassion was not policy. It was instinct. For the American women stationed there, discipline demanded distance, yet maternal impulse often overruled regulations. In this uneasy landscape, half battlefield, half hospital, the psychological front of post-war Germany began. These encounters between conqueror and captive, nurse and boy, marked the first fragile gestures of peace. And as the Reich collapsed mile by mile, the machinery of indoctrination crumbled too. The boys who had once sworn to die for Hitler now waited quietly for bread. The world had shifted overnight, but understanding the scale of that collapse required more than emotion. It demanded context on both sides. The humanitarian mechanisms that followed the armies, and the moral reckoning that would soon define the occupation. The next step in the story shows how these American women, nurses, Red Cross workers, and civil affairs officers transformed from medical personnel into reluctant guardians of a broken generation. In May 1945, the guns fell silent, but the work of war did not. Germany was a landscape of ruins, cities reduced to blackened skeletons, roads choked with displaced civilians, and fields dotted with millions of prisoners of war. The Allied advance had shattered the Wehrmacht, and with it, the illusion of adulthood for tens of thousands of German boys who had been thrust into uniforms in the final months of the Reich. When American forces occupied the western zones, they encountered a humanitarian problem on a scale unseen in modern Europe. There were millions of POWs, millions more refugees, and an entire generation of children who had lost homes, families, and identities. Among the U.S. forces, it was the Army Nurse Corps and American Red Cross that stepped into the void between military necessity and human compassion. Most of these women had served through the hardest years of the European campaign, tending to the wounded at Normandy, Bastogne, and across the Rhine. They were trained to handle blood, not emotions. Yet, as the front turned into an occupation, their mission changed from saving soldiers to saving survivors, including those who, weeks earlier, had been considered the enemy. The Red Cross established mobile clubmobiles, relief stations, and soup kitchens near POW enclosures. They distributed basic hygiene kits, checked for lice, recorded ages, and noted anyone under 16 for medical evaluation. In the reports of the 7th Army's Civil Affairs Division, there are repeated mentions of juvenile prisoners, youth cases, and child Volkssturm, treated not as combatants, but as wards. These boys, some as young as 13, arrived barefoot, starved and often ill. Their indoctrination had dissolved in the face of hunger. Most had been told that Americans would shoot them on sight. Instead, they found women in olive drab jackets handing them bowls of soup and calling them boys, not soldiers. The nurses faced their own contradictions. The regulations demanded neutrality, no fraternization, no emotional attachment, no acts that could compromise discipline. Yet reality tested those rules daily. In one letter home, Red Cross worker Helen G. wrote, "They come in shaking, filthy, terrified. We have to remind ourselves they are the enemy. But when you wash a child's hands, that line disappears." American military hospitals began developing informal protocols for dealing with the minors. Young prisoners were grouped separately when possible, assigned lighter duties, and given rations calibrated for refeeding after starvation. Civil affairs officers coordinated with the newly forming UNRWA, United Nations, Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, to transfer them eventually to German youth welfare offices or displaced persons camps. The interactions between these boys and the American women caring for them became a quiet, recurring image of post-war Germany. In small towns like Hemmer, Remagen, and Darmstadt, witnesses described scenes of Red Cross workers washing lice from a boy's hair or bandaging a leg wound while he stared wordlessly at her wedding ring, a reminder of a normal life that no longer existed in his world. For many of these women, the work took a toll. They were veterans too, but of compassion. They had seen what hate could do to a generation. Many later wrote that the hardest part of their service was realizing how young the enemy really was. The occupation's first months blurred into a haze of logistical triage, distributing calories, preventing epidemics, rebuilding roads, reopening schools. Yet beneath those administrative acts ran a subtler current, the slow human redefinition of who these German youths were. No longer Hitler's last soldiers, they were now seen, hesitantly, as children in need of saving. Every time an American woman called a captured boy son, it was more than kindness. It was reclamation. A word meant to overwrite 12 years of indoctrination. A single syllable that, for some, carried more power than any surrender document. And that word, that tone of unexpected humanity, would ripple into the psychological heart of the occupation, the confrontation between the ideals of vengeance and the instinct for mercy. The next part of the story turns from background to perspective, exploring how different human, tactical, and moral angles shaped this fragile meeting between defeated boys and victorious women. 1. The human angle. Hunger, shock, and surrender. When the Third Reich collapsed, hunger became the first truth that no propaganda could hide. Across the Rhine and Ruhr, American soldiers described rows of captured boys barely standing. Hollow eyes, shaking hands, bellies drawn tight from starvation. Many had not eaten properly for weeks. Bread crusts from ransacked homes, raw turnips, or melted snow had kept them alive during the retreat. In the prisoner cages, these boys no longer resembled soldiers. They flinched when spoken to and guarded their tin cups like weapons. Some wept without tears, the body too dehydrated to follow emotion. It was this raw vulnerability that first disarmed the Americans. When nurses or Red Cross women approached with bowls of broth, the reaction was almost always the same: disbelief. A hand reached out hesitantly, expecting pain, not kindness. The boys had been told Americans were monsters. Yet here they were, being fed and treated by women whose eyes carried neither anger nor pity, only weary humanity. The moment of recognition that the enemy was a child often broke even the hardest soldiers. Compassion was not a political act. It was a reflex of decency. And in that reflex, war began to lose its absolute power. The tactical angle, why they were there. The presence of these boys in uniform was not random. It was the final symptom of a dying regime. By early 1945, the Wehrmacht had exhausted its reserves. The Volkssturm decree turned every town square into a recruitment ground. Hitler youth leaders, many themselves barely 20, scoured schools and churches for volunteers. Anti-aircraft units manned by teenage gunners had been the start. But by March, entire platoons of boys were deployed to defend bridges, crossroads, and small villages along the Rhine. Some carried Panzerfausts they could barely lift. Others were given rifles without ammunition, a desperate bluff to delay advancing Allied units. For the Americans, the discovery of these soldiers created tactical confusion. Engagement rules were clear. Armed combatants were legitimate targets. But what happens when the combatant is a 15-year-old shaking behind sandbags? Reports from the 9th Armored Division note several encounters where U.S. troops hesitated to fire, unsure whether they faced resistance or tragedy. In many cases, the battle ended without shots. German youths raised their hands the moment tanks appeared, relieved that surrender meant survival. Those who resisted often did so out of fear, not courage, terrified of SS officers behind them more than the Americans in front. The tactical landscape of 1945 thus became morally inverted, the victors carrying rations, the defeated carrying childhoods they would never reclaim. The medical angle, refeeding the lost generation. Behind every fence and field hospital lay another battle, the medical one. American nurses and medics were trained to treat shock and trauma, but starvation was a new enemy. The boys arriving in April and May were not wounded in the conventional sense. They were collapsing from malnutrition, dysentery, and exhaustion. Some weighed less than 40 kilograms. Field hospital logs from the 16th Evacuation Hospital describe the process: washing, delousing, and rationing food in stages. Too much bread or milk at once could kill a starving body. Nurses had to measure kindness in calories. Medical tents smelled of disinfectant and boiled cabbage. Rows of cots lined with skeletal teenagers, each tagged not by rank but by birth year: 1929, 1930, 1931. For the first time, the U.S. Army's medical system had to treat an enemy not as an adult opponent, but as a child, victim of ideology and famine. Many nurses later admitted that the hardest part wasn't the labor. It was the silence. The boys rarely spoke. They simply ate, slept, and stared. Some broke down when touched, others when addressed softly. The human body had survived, but the mind was still at war. The cultural maternal angle. Women between duty and instinct in the post-war camps and hospitals. American women occupied a unique space. Uniformed, disciplined, yet quietly maternal. They represented both authority and comfort, the two forces most absent in a collapsing Germany. Officially, they were not to show affection or use personal terms of endearment. But war has its own grammar. When a nurse brushed dust from a boy's hair or tucked a blanket under his chin, that gesture spoke louder than any order. Many of these women were mothers themselves, or had brothers the same age as the captured youths. The contrast was unbearable. Imagining their own sons in tattered field gray, kneeling in surrender. The phrase, "You're our sons now," which circulated among Red Cross circles and later memoirs, symbolized a deeper truth. That nurture, once awakened, ignored nationality. The cultural weight of that act was immense. In a Europe poisoned by hatred, American women embodied a counterforce, care without conquest. Their discipline did not erase empathy. It framed it, and within that frame, the first fragile sketches of reconciliation began to appear. Each of these angles revealed a different truth of the same moment: the fall of a world, witnessed through the eyes of those who had come to heal it. But there were still other lenses: leadership, morality, and the psychology of indoctrination, that shaped how both sides understood what had happened. The leadership and policy angle. Orders for compassion. Leadership in war is often measured by victories, but in the spring of 1945, leadership was tested in restraint. When reports of captured miners reached higher U.S. commands, officers had to decide how to classify these boys. The Geneva Convention made no explicit provision for underage combatants. They were still technically prisoners of war, but treating them as adults felt morally wrong and logistically impractical. Civil affairs branches within the U.S. Army quickly issued guidance. Underage German POWs were to be separated, medically examined, and, where feasible, transferred to special enclosures with lighter rations and care oversight. Many commanders cooperated readily. Others questioned why resources should be diverted to the enemy's youth when Europe's civilians were starving. Yet, voices within the command, particularly among chaplains and medical officers, argued that mercy was itself a weapon against ideology. The notion that compassion could be strategic was new and radical. Every kind act undermined the Nazi narrative that Americans were barbarians. Some officers, such as Colonel John P. Riley of the 9th Army's Civil Affairs Division, emphasized that the future of Germany would be shaped not by punishment alone, but by education and rehabilitation. His memos spoke plainly. These are not men of the Reich. They are its final victims. The result was a quiet policy shift. By late 1945, youth sections appeared in several U.S.-administered POW camps. The priority was not retribution, but reintegration, planting the seeds of a democratic identity. Before the soil of defeat hardened into bitterness. The wide moral and legal angle, the gray zone of accountability legally. War is binary. You are combatant or civilian, guilty or innocent. But the faces of those German boys blurred the categories. Were they perpetrators or products of indoctrination? American officers, lawyers, and psychologists debated this question as post-war tribunals loomed. The Nuremberg trials would prosecute the architects of the regime, but what of the generation it had molded? Military lawyers acknowledged a vacuum. The teenagers captured at the front had technically borne arms, but international law had not yet defined child soldier. They were both participants and victims. The United States faced a moral paradox, upholding justice while modeling humanity. For many American women in the field, this dilemma was lived, not theorized. They saw lice, hunger, and terror, not ideology. To them, the legal question dissolved into a moral one. If you can save a child, do you ask first which flag he served? Reports from civil affairs detachments mention behavioral instability, emotional shock, and withdrawal symptoms among the youths. The U.S. command's decision to house them separately, feed them carefully, and eventually release many to youth rehabilitation centers reflected an early recognition of psychological trauma, before the term PTSD existed. In this moral gray zone, victory meant something more profound than surrender. It meant redefining civilization after barbarism. The treatment of these boys became a litmus test for what the victors intended to build. The psychological angle, undoing indoctrination. The deepest battle did not take place on the map of Europe, but inside the human mind. For 12 years, the Nazi state had rewritten childhood. It replaced play with drills, affection with duty, and independent thought with obedience. The Hitler Youth had been more than a uniform. It had been a moral compass pointing only toward the Führer. When that compass shattered in 1945, many boys were left directionless. American medics described them as quiet, polite, vacant. They obeyed any order instantly, even when told simply to rest or eat. Psychologists attached to the Allied occupation noted the identity vacuum among the youth population. Without the structure of the Hitler Jugend, they struggled to define themselves. Some cried at night, not from pain, but from confusion. The enemy had turned gentle, the world upside down. For the American women caring for them, rehumanization began with routine. Meals at fixed hours, clean clothes, simple conversation. "You're safe now," one might say, not as propaganda but as repetition therapy, teaching the nervous system what peace sounded like. Each small act chipped away at the mental armor forged by years of indoctrination. In the quiet, a new pattern formed. Trust replacing fear. One Red Cross diary from late 1945 records, "They came to us wearing swastikas and left wearing smiles, but none of it happened overnight. It began with a meal and a word, son." By the end of that year, the outlines of a new Europe were forming, one where care was strategy and mercy a form of strength. But the transformation had not been bloodless, nor easy. The decisive moment, when compassion finally replaced conflict, arrived during the chaotic weeks of surrender itself, when the last German defenses fell and the human cost was laid bare. It was here that the story reached its turning point. April 1945, the Western Front no longer resembled a line of defense. It was a flood of surrender. The Ruhr pocket, once the industrial heart of Germany, had become a vast cage of prisoners. American forces advanced through ruined towns and collapsed bridges, gathering tens of thousands each day. In the chaos of victory, no one expected so many of them to be children. At first, the Army's prisoner intake officers thought it was a clerical error. Names and birth years scribbled in pencil seemed absurd. 1929, 1930, 1931. Some of the boys were barely 15. They arrived in tattered field gray uniforms, carrying rifles that dragged along the ground. Their boots were mismatched, their belts tied with wire. Many had been captured during the destruction of the Ruhr's last pockets of resistance, places like Essen, Remscheid, and Hagen, where local Volkssturm units had thrown everything into the path of the advancing 9th U.S. Army. In one of those collection centers, a sprawling open field near Remagen, the scene was both military and surreal. Barbed wire stretched in long silver lines, and within them sat an ocean of exhausted faces. The ground was slick with rain. The air reeked of mud, sweat, and smoke from burning vehicles. Guards barked instructions over loudspeakers, while medical tents billowed in the wind. Inside one such tent, nurses and medics worked in shifts. Each prisoner was checked, tagged, and sorted. Those under 16 were quietly marked with a blue stripe on their card. No announcement was made, but word spread quickly among the staff. There are children among them. An Army nurse, Lieutenant Mary Louise Cartwright, recorded in her journal, "They came in by the hundreds, small, shaking, filthy. The older ones tried to stand straight, but their faces gave them away. Some looked at us as if they expected to be shot. When we gave them water, they cried." Outside, field kitchens were hastily set up by the Red Cross. Soup pots simmered under canvas tarps, ladles scraping the bottom every few minutes. The first boys in line were so weak they couldn't lift their mugs. American women had to hold the cups to their lips, and that was when something changed. Not militarily, but humanly. The prisoners had been taught that Americans were brutal, that capture meant humiliation or death. Instead, they were met by steady hands and soft voices. One Red Cross volunteer, while distributing blankets, instinctively called a trembling youth son. Those nearby later recalled how the boy froze, eyes wide, lips quivering, before lowering his head and sobbing uncontrollably. It was a moment that rippled across the camp. Others began to cry too, not from fear this time, but from the collapse of everything they'd been told to believe. The word son became a kind of emotional ceasefire, an unplanned surrender of hatred. Meanwhile, Army photographers captured rows of teenage prisoners sitting cross-legged in the mud, their helmets beside them, hands resting limply on their knees. Some of those photos, later archived under Ruhr encirclement, April 1945, would reveal the scale of Germany's desperation, the youthfulness of its final army. As the days passed, the camp grew to tens of thousands. The logistics were staggering. Food, water, sanitation, shelter, medical tents overflowed. Nurses administered vaccines to lines of boys who winced but did not resist. Lice treatments became routine. One medic noted that most of the boys were severely malnourished, their bodies prematurely aged by deprivation. Yet amidst this grim efficiency, a fragile humanity emerged. The American women, bound by duty but guided by instinct, began treating the boys not as captured enemies, but as patients, even children. They washed their clothes, tended to sores, and spoke to them gently. The boys, in turn, began to speak halting English words they had learned in school. "Thank you, please, water." The Red Cross set up a small recreation tent near the field hospital, where recovered soldiers, including former Hitler youth, were given crayons, paper, and simple reading materials. Some drew houses, others drew fields, trees, or animals. Almost none drew flags. Every act of care, every gesture of normalcy, chipped away at the armor of indoctrination. It was not forgiveness that the Americans offered. It was something quieter. Recognition. For the U.S. personnel on site, this was the real turning point. Not the capture of territory, but the reclamation of innocence, however brief or symbolic. The war was still technically on. Yet here in the mud and tents of the Ruhr, a different kind of victory was taking shape. One that could never be written in after-action reports. From this point onward, the focus of the American occupation began to shift. The command structure started issuing new orders on handling underage prisoners, reorganizing medical priorities, and coordinating with relief agencies for rehabilitation. Compassion, once incidental, was becoming procedure. The next stage of the story takes us deeper into that. Transition from emergency triage to structured mercy, as the occupation system learned, to care for those who had once been trained to hate. By late April 1945, the German front had ceased to exist in any coherent form. Columns of defeated troops streamed westward toward the American lines, desperate to surrender before Soviet forces arrived. Among them were entire companies of teenage boys, remnants of shattered Hitler Youth regiments, Volkssturm militias, and school detachments thrown into the chaos of retreat. They were Germany's last army, starved, frightened, and barely old enough to shave. In Bavaria and the Ruhr, American divisions now faced a strange responsibility: to manage not only victory, but mercy. Combat had ended in most areas, yet the suffering did not. The boys captured in those final weeks filled temporary cages, schoolhouses, and barns turned into holding areas. They slept under tarps, wrapped in blankets stamped U.S. Army property. At dawn, medics moved through the rows, checking pulses, recording temperatures, writing M for malnutrition or D for dysentery on rough paper tags. Army nurses disinfected wounds, shaved matted hair, and tried to coax the most withdrawn into eating again. For many of these boys, the presence of women in uniform was disorienting, a symbol of both power and gentleness they had never known. Lieutenant Cartwright wrote again in her diary that week, "They are polite to the point of breaking. They stand when spoken to, salute awkwardly, call me Fräulein. Some cannot meet my eyes. When I tell them to sit, they obey instantly, not as soldiers, but as children afraid to make a mistake." In those small acts of obedience, the war's psychological residue was visible. Years of discipline had taught these boys that emotion was weakness, that compassion was foreign, and that women were secondary to the state. Yet here, in the ruins of the Reich, the inverse became their salvation. In one camp near Bad Kreuznach, Red Cross workers began what they called the rehumanization line. It was not official policy, merely a sequence of acts that had become habit. A nurse would hand each boy a cup of soup. A medic would check his hands for infection. And finally, a volunteer would look him in the eyes and ask his name, slowly, kindly, as if returning it to him. Names mattered. For months, these boys had been addressed only by ranks or numbers. The simple acknowledgement of "Wer bist du?" "Who are you?" "Scheier," was the first step in undoing the uniform. Some tried to maintain stoicism, others broke down instantly. Witnesses described boys covering their faces with their sleeves, trembling as they realized they were being treated not as enemies, but as human beings. The transformation rippled outward. Soldiers guarding the perimeter softened their tone. Mess officers began reserving extra milk for the miners. Even among hardened combat veterans, something shifted, an unspoken recognition that the enemy had been a child all along. Meanwhile, higher command took notice. Reports from medical units and civil affairs detachments reached headquarters in France and Washington, describing the youth POW situation. It was no longer isolated. There were thousands. Some were released after screening. Others were sent to special internment centers for re-education under German social workers supervised by the Allies. The Americans also coordinated with British and French forces to develop standardized procedures. The new guidelines emphasized nutrition, shelter, and moral supervision rather than punishment. For the first time in modern warfare, the victors treated child combatants not as criminals, but as victims of a failed state. In the camp hospitals, the human moments continued. One nurse recounted a boy who refused to sleep on a bed, insisting on the floor because that's where soldiers slept. Another wrote of a youth who, after recovering, helped her translate between prisoners and medical staff, correcting her German with shy humor. For the American women, these encounters were emotionally costly. Many had tended to the dying on D-Day in the Ardennes and at Remagen. They had seen the brutality of war in its fullest form. Yet caring for these boys, their supposed enemies, left a deeper scar. It was one thing to face an enemy in battle. It was another to face the wreckage of his childhood. Each night, when the camp quieted, the nurses wrote letters home. They rarely mentioned the horrors, only the quiet gestures, a smile, a handshake, a whispered thank you. One letter read, "We feed them and call them our sons, though they are not ours." Perhaps that is the point. As May approached, Germany's unconditional surrender loomed. The boys in those camps would never see combat again. For them, the end of the war arrived not with gunfire or parades, but with warmth, food, and a human voice that refused to see them as expendable. That moment, when compassion became stronger than hatred, marked the true turning point of the story. And in the days that followed, As the war finally ended and the occupation began, the consequences of those encounters would ripple outward, shaping the policies, relief efforts, and moral framework of the post-war world. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The world exhaled, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was exhaustion. Across the newly conquered western zones, the U.S. Army faced an impossible humanitarian equation. Millions of POWs, millions of civilians without homes, and tens of thousands of boys who no longer fit any category. They were too old to be children, too young to be soldiers. In the first weeks after surrender, the American occupation forces began reorganizing the chaos left behind. Field hospitals turned into temporary shelters. Barracks became holding centers. Railway stations overflowed with displaced people clutching bundles, and papers stamped "temporary release." Among them moved the same teenage faces that had once stood trembling in surrender. Many of the captured youths were screened by U.S. civil affairs teams. Those under 16 were classified as Jugendgefangene, youth prisoners, and gradually released into the custody of local authorities, churches, or relatives if they could be found. But for thousands, no family remained. Fathers were dead or missing on the Eastern Front. Mothers had vanished in the bombing. These boys drifted through post-war Germany like ghosts, too disciplined to beg, too broken to rebuild. American relief agencies tried to fill the gap. The Red Cross partnered with the newly formed UNRWA to open orphan shelters, nutrition centers, and schools across the Western occupation zones. Former Hitler Youth uniforms were exchanged for donated civilian clothes. In some towns, local women joined American nurses to run Kinderküchen, children's kitchens, serving diluted soup, bread, and milk. The shift from military care to civilian rehabilitation was not clean. Bureaucracy lagged behind need. Supply trucks broke down. Diseases spread faster than paperwork could follow. Yet despite shortages, there was a sense of collective purpose: to prevent starvation, to stabilize, to educate. Compassion was becoming policy. Reports from the U.S. 12th Army Group noted a visible change in behavior among the released boys. Within weeks of steady food and structured activity, they began to talk, to laugh, even to volunteer for camp chores. One American psychologist attached to the program observed, "The uniform had made them old. The bread made them young again." Still, not everyone approved. Some Allied soldiers, still grieving for fallen comrades, found the idea of comforting former enemies intolerable. In the canteens and barracks, arguments flared. "They were shooting at us last month," some said. "Now we're feeding them." Others replied, "That's exactly why we won. Because we can." In the newspapers, the German youth question began to surface. How could a society that had raised its children to die for a dictator now teach them to live in democracy? American officials recognized that the answer would define the future of Europe. They saw the boys not as remnants of the Reich, but as the foundation of what came next. Relief programs expanded through late 1945. By winter, care packages, a new American initiative, began arriving in devastated German towns. Inside were powdered milk, sugar, canned meat, and soap. The recipients were often those same youths once captured behind barbed wire. The symbolism was impossible to miss. The same nation that had defeated them was now feeding them. For the American women who had stayed on through the occupation, the months after surrender blurred together. They worked in schools, hospitals, and food lines, translating orders, tending wounds, writing names in ledgers. Each face was another story. Some boys asked about America, others about their families. A few still carried the stiffness of military training, but most were simply tired. In their diaries, the nurses wrote less about war and more about routine, ration counts, weather, new arrivals. But occasionally a line broke through. "He smiled today," or "They called us mothers." Those fragments captured what official reports could not: the fragile rebirth of empathy amid ruins. The war was over, but the work of peace had just begun. And the next months, the slow reconstruction of hearts, cities, and identities, would test whether the compassion shown in the camps could survive beyond the wire. By early 1946, Germany was no longer a battlefield. It was a vast orphanage of memory. The rubble still smoked in Berlin, Cologne, and Frankfurt, but across the American zone, something faintly resembling normal life was beginning to take shape. Trains ran again. Schools reopened in damaged buildings. Children played in bombed-out streets with toys carved from wood and scraps of metal. The boys who had once worn Hitler Youth uniforms were now dispersed through this fragile landscape. Some had been reunited with surviving family members. Others lived in youth hostels or Heime, group homes established under Allied supervision. A number of them worked for rations, clearing debris, fixing roads, or helping at aid stations. For many, the first stable adult figures in their post-war lives were American women. Nurses, social workers, and teachers assigned to the reconstruction mission. In towns like Wiesbaden, Kassel, and Augsburg, U.S. occupation authorities and Red Cross volunteers transformed bombed-out schools into temporary classrooms. Lessons began not with ideology, but with hygiene, nutrition, and trust. Boys who had once shouted Nazi slogans now practiced English phrases or copied arithmetic problems from blackboards. The transformation was slow, fragile, but visible. Reports from the U.S. military government for Germany describe these efforts in precise terms. Re-education begins with routine, meals, order, repetition. The child must relearn dependence before responsibility. The philosophy was simple. Restore humanity first, democracy later. In some camps, the same American nurses who had treated the boys as POWs now visited them as teachers or mentors. They helped run vaccination drives, literacy programs, and even sports clubs. Football fields appeared amid the ruins, with chalk lines drawn over cracked asphalt. American soldiers sometimes joined the games, uniforms traded for shirt sleeves. Each shared laugh chipped away at the invisible wall that had separated conqueror and conquered. The moral transformation was mirrored in policy. By late 1946, the U.S. command formally handed over responsibility for German youth welfare to the newly restructured local administrations. Aid continued, but under German direction, guided by Allied oversight. It was the beginning of a slow return of self-governance. Yet for the American women who had served through it all, the departure was bittersweet. They left behind wards who had become surrogate sons, boys they had nursed, fed, scolded, and encouraged. Letters from these women, preserved in archives, reveal a recurring sentiment: pride mixed with grief. "They were our sons for a little while," one nurse wrote. "We gave them food, and they gave us back our faith in humanity." The cultural impact of those months lingered long after uniforms were folded away. The image of the American nurse comforting a German boy became one of the quiet icons of post-war reconstruction, rarely photographed, often forgotten, but deeply symbolic. It represented not triumph, but transcendence, the moment when the victors chose healing over hatred. In the broader sweep of history, these encounters helped define the moral tone of the American occupation. While politics debated denazification and reparations, on the ground, compassion was already rebuilding the first bridges between former enemies. The generation that had been trained to die for Hitler was now learning to live under democracy, because someone had called them sons instead of soldiers. By 1947, many of those boys had grown taller, healthier, and hungrier for a future they could finally imagine. The wounds of war would take years to fade, but the memory of mercy endured. When they spoke of the Americans later in life, they rarely mentioned weapons or orders, only food, warmth, and the strange kindness of women who saw them not as enemies, but as children lost in a war they never chose. That was the real victory, one not written in treaties or history books, but in the quiet restoration of innocence. And from that fragile peace, a new world slowly emerged. History often measures victory in borders gained or enemies defeated. Yet the truest victories are quieter. They happen in moments when mercy triumphs over vengeance. The story of the German boys and the American women who cared for them is one of those moments. In the spring of 1945, Europe stood at the edge of moral exhaustion. Cities lay in ruins, nations bled from the inside, and faith in humanity had nearly vanished. But within that darkness, compassion reappeared, not in speeches or grand gestures, but in small acts. A blanket offered, a name remembered, a single word whispered. Son. Those American women, nurses, Red Cross volunteers, field workers, carried more than medical kits. They carried a quiet conviction that decency could outlive war. They did not excuse the crimes of a regime, but they refused to pass its cruelty forward. In the ruins of ideology, they built something the world had almost forgotten: empathy. For the German boys, that kindness became the first lesson of a new life. They learned that strength could exist without hate, that authority could nurture rather than command. Many would later recall the strangeness of it: to be shown care by the enemy, to be fed by the hands they had been told would destroy them. In that reversal, their idea of the world changed forever. The legacy of that encounter lingers quietly beneath the louder chapters of history. It reminds us that peace is not a treaty. It is a behavior repeated until it becomes belief. The war ended in May 1945, but the real ending came later, in tents and kitchens, in the steady hands of those who chose compassion over contempt. When American women called those German boys sons, it was not sentiment. It was reclamation. In that moment, humanity reclaimed itself from the wreckage. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that compassion can survive even in the ruins of war, take a moment to honor the quiet heroes of history. Subscribe for more true World War II stories told through humanity's lens. Real events, real people, and the moments that changed our world forever. Subscribe to the channel for more cinematic documentaries on the untold side of WI2. The courage, the mercy, and the lessons still echoing today. Because history isn't just about who fought, it's about who healed.